There are only a limited number of texts in the Old Testament where you have both righteousness and faith being discussed together. And especially if you can relate works to it somehow. And the Psalms and Genesis 15, those are two of the places. And it's been pointed out that's why Paul is going to these texts, because these are two of the only texts where he could really make the point he wants to make, which is that you don't need to do works in order to be justified. Now, in context, I think that the type of work he has primarily in mind, and again, this is my view, is works of the law, meaning actions done in order to obey the Mosaic law. And I'm not restricting that to ceremonial works. I think when Paul thinks if you're obeying the Mosaic law, whatever you're doing, if you're obeying the Mosaic law because you think that is what will make you right with God, you're wrong, because what will make you right with God is Christ, not the Mosaic law. And so what I think Paul is doing is going to these passages in the Old Testament to show that you can be right with God apart from obeying the Mosaic law. And one text that's helpful to show that is Genesis, because Abraham was obviously right with God here. God says he reckoned him righteous. Right. And he was not circumcised, so he wasn't obeying that part of the law. Similarly, in the Psalms, David is talking about being forgiven for having broken the law. So you can, again, be right even though you haven't with God, even though you haven't obeyed the Mosaic law. And so I think that's why Paul is pulling on these two passages. But if we take the passages individually and say, well, how would we relate these to the doctrine of justification? I would say the Psalm passage refers to the acquisition, or in David's case, the reacquisition of righteousness. So after having fallen into sin, coming back, repenting and coming back to God and being made righteous again in God's sight by his forgiveness, I would say that's how that relates. So if it's not strictly because David had already been following God in his life, it wouldn't really be the beginning of his walk with God. It would be the equivalent today of falling into mortal sin and then getting right with God afterwards. In a Catholic context, that would typically be through confession. In terms of the Genesis text, though, in Genesis 15, I think that fits the ongoing growth in holiness aspect of justification, because Abraham has just fought this great battle for God. God is going to reward him for having been a faithful servant. So Abraham, God promises him the descendants. Abraham believes God, and that belief in God is both a morally good work produced by God's grace, and it's an act of faith. And so I would say that Abraham is cooperating with God's grace in such a way that he grows in faith and charity. He has faith working through love, and God therefore says, okay, you're righteous. You're even more righteous than you were a moment ago because you've just cooperated with my grace, and you've just done a new act of faith working through love, and thus grown in righteousness. So I would say that the Psalms relate to the reacquisition of righteousness, and Genesis 15 relates to growth in transformative righteousness. But Paul picks these two passages because they both illustrate how you can be right in God's sight without obeying the Mosaic law.